Good morning. Well, I don't know if it's morning where you are because you could watch this anytime, but it's morning where I am. And so good morning to you. I'm glad that you are here. We are experimenting with a video so we don't have to have class this week. While you're watching this, I'll be in balmy Florida. I hope right now you are on spring break, so I hope you're having fun and doing something enjoyable. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. Maybe it's 2 weeks for you, I don't know. We picked up last week, we were talking about aggregate demand. And if you missed last week, please meet with somebody that was there because we covered a lot and it was really important. Remember, aggregate demand, it's not exactly like, it's not like micro demand, although the curve is shaped the same. Micro demand is one product. So how do we deal with one product? Aggregate demand is demand for the entire economy. So remember we talked about it's the same things that make up GDP. So it's consumption, investment, government spending, and net export. So all those things together. And it falls on a curve like this, the same things that we talked about. But when we talk about price over here, we have price on this price curve. It's not price like we have regularly on a micro curve. This price is based on a price index. And so we said typically in the United States it's the consumer price index, which is really all about inflation. Inflation. So how much more am I paying for an item versus what I paid off of a base year? So how much more am I paying versus what I paid off of a base year? And as consumers, as people that buy things, that's what we pay, that's what we care about. So an aggregate demand curve is going to slope downwards. The more that we have to pay for something, the less of it we want. And we talked about all the reasons why that might be the case. So now we want to talk about a supply curve. First, we want to talk about the long run. And in all these things that matter, we're going to end up talking about the short run because the short run is really the only thing that we can control. So I want to start with the long run, and then we're going to talk about the immediate short run, and then we're going to talk about the short run because the long run and the immediate short run, we really don't have much control over those. But in the short run, there are some things that the government can do and stuff around those terms, and that's what we want to talk about because those are the things that matter. So first, let's start with the long run. What happens in the long run? Well, what do we have on our axes here? Well, on one side we have price, and remember this price is an index. Typically in the United States, it's our consumer price index. And down here, remember, we don't have quantity like we normally have. We have our GDP. So what we're asking for supply is at each price point, how much do producers want to produce? Okay, so how much at each price point do producers want to produce? Well, typically on a supply curve, typically you'd see it going up, right? You'd say the higher prices that producers can get, the more they want to produce, right? If they're going to get more money for an item, they'd want to produce more of that item. That just makes sense because we can get more profit for it. But in the long run, what actually happens is that in the long run, you end up having a supply curve that is straight up. What happens in the long run is that prices are completely flexible. So prices can move all sorts of ways in the long run. And what you have happen is in a long run supply curve is that they fall to a very comfortable place. And the long run curve just stays in a comfortable place and it meets there. Now it can shift to the left or to the right based on different things happening, and there may be things that make it move. But it doesn't slope. It falls to a place that is the comfortable place. And at this place in the long run, this is where we come to what we have as what we call full employment. Full employment. Now remember what we've talked about. Full employment, That doesn't mean everybody has a job, right? Full employment is not the place where everybody has a job, because when everybody has a job, we have problems. Full employment is the place where we have where we have no cyclical unemployment. We only have frictional unemployment, and we have whatever the other type of unemployment is we talked about that I can't remember right now. But we have no cyclical unemployment. That's full employment, right? And economists come up with that number of what is that number that's full employment. So this is the place of full employment. Now sometimes we've talked about that we can work over top of full employment for certain periods of time and things like that. But GDP on the long run, we're going to end up at a place where we sit on full employment. That's where we want to sit. Now, let's talk about what does the immediate short run look like. What does the immediate short run look like? Well, in the immediate short run, sorry, let me move my helper slides so I can draw this right. In the immediate short run, we have the exact opposite problem. See, in the long run, all prices are flexible. And that means that we can move everything that needs to move, and we end up moving all the prices that we need to move to come to a place where we end up in full employment. But in the immediate short run, we end up in a place that looks like this. And this is immediate short run. And the immediate short run is a challenging place. It's a challenging place because in the immediate short run, there's not a whole lot that the government can do. There's not a whole lot that spending can do. There's not a whole lot that can be done that can alter the economy. Because in the immediate short run, we have a problem with sticky prices, and we have a problem, well, really it's a sticky prices problem. Because in the immediate short run, both input prices and output prices are fixed. So you can see, if input prices and output prices are fixed, you can't move. You can't shift from this place. So it's just going to be a flat line across regardless of what's happening down with GDP. So we're going to be flat lined across. So when economists talk about what can the government do, what can happen, whether we're having extreme growth and we need to pull it back, when we talk about fiscal or monetary policy, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, when we talk about aggregate supply and how the government can affect things on the supply side of economics, when we talk about all those things, we're trying to talk about short-run aggregate supply. Because in the long run, it doesn't have much impact. In the immediate short run, it can have no impact. It's only in the short run that we can have an impact. So let's move on to talk about something else. Let's talk about aggregate supply in the short run. Okay. I should have just left that up there. That would have been a lot easier, but I didn't. Okay, let's draw our same thing. Okay, we have our curve here. This is going to be our aggregate supply long run curve. So this is going to be where, I'm sorry, we have price out here. We have real GDP down here. And this is going to be our kind of natural output. This is where the economy wants to live. This is going to be full employment. It's where the economy wants to live. And this is going to be our kind of short, immediate short run. There you go. You got the rest. Aggregate supply. Okay, and then let's do another one with out here. Let's do this. Out here is kind of our maximum. That's not, oh yeah, that's how you spell maximum. Is our maximum output. And that's a little bit different than our production possibilities curve, because remember we said we could produce outside of our production possibilities curve, right? So we said we could produce outside of our production possibilities curve. So we can almost imagine that this aggregate long run natural output, that's kind of our production and possibilities curve. This is, hey, you can't go past this. So our aggregate supply curve, it's going to look, what color haven't I used? We'll stick with black. It's going to look something like this, and it's going to look a lot like a supply curve in the regular micro model. So it's going to be upward sloping, and it's going to look something like that. Okay? It's going to be upward sloping, and in an ideal universe, it's going to cross right where the long run aggregate supply and the immediate short run aggregate supply crosses. And if it does, and if we have an aggregate demand curve that crosses in the same place, then our economy is running beautifully, because that's what we want to see. We want to see them cross, and then the economy is running in a healthy place. That's when everything works great. Okay? And what happens is we can have things, there are times when it doesn't work this way. There are times when things and everything gets moved up. But what tends to happen is there's a few things that happen, and we're going to talk about those later, okay? So let's move from the whiteboard over to our TV and look at some of our sorry, I can't get it out of my pocket. Some of our favorite slides here. I'll pull this out. Can you guys thank Hugh, who's behind the camera for me today? I'm imagining wonderful applause right now. Yay, Hugh! Wow! Okay, are y'all bored yet at home? I hope you're not bored. This is hard to do. I like it a lot better when you're all right in front of me. Do you just want me to get finished? Because I imagine you're just wanting me to get finished right now. Okay, Hugh's not falling asleep yet, so I'm imagining you're not falling asleep yet. Okay, so we have this lovely aggregate supply curve. So we were talking about aggregate demand and what kind of shifts that aggregate demand curve, right? And we talked about a change in consumption, a change in investment, a change in government spending, a change in net exports. Well, the thing that's going to shift supply is a change in what makes up the supply curve. And a change in supply is a change in resources, right? And so we talked about resources would be land, capital, labor, or entrepreneurship. So when we look at those things, so what's going to change? Domestic resource prices. So if labor goes up, we're going to talk about what might change labor prices. So if labor goes up, capital prices, so the prices for capital. So if we have drops in the price come to me. If we have drops in the prices of, dude, you guys know how this happens to me sometimes. Just give me grace. Technology. So if technology prices decrease, that might push our aggregate supply curve to the right and make things cheaper. Land prices. If land prices go up, that might push our aggregate supply curve to the left. Or if we have imported resources that go up, so we're starting possibly, there's a possibility, there's rumors of a trade war. So if we go into a trade war, we might have import prices go up. That could push our aggregate supply curve to the left, and that might be a problem. So we might have something like that happen. Another huge impactor of aggregate supply is productivity. So when we had the Great Recession, one of the great things that came out of the Great Recession was that we had productivity increase dramatically. We had cuts in human personnel and human capital, so we had a lot of people fired. But we also saw that businesses said we need more out of every person that we have. So we asked more and more out of every person that we had, and they were able to produce more and more out of every person. They got more and more out of everything that they did. And so we had productivity go up. And so when productivity goes up, that actually pushes our aggregate demand, our aggregate supply curve to the right. So how do we figure out productivity? Well, it's a pretty simple equation. You guys can figure it out on your own. It's just total output divided by total input. So how much money do I get out of everything I make versus how much money does it take to make it? That gives me my total productivity. Or total per unit production cost, total input cost versus total output cost, or total outputs. It's pretty simple math. You guys got this one. Okay. And then obviously what's another thing that goes into it is my legal environment. This is one of the reasons why people tend to like, business owners tend to like Republicans in office, is that Republicans tend to cut the amount of legal and institutional oversight on businesses. So many businesses love Republicans in office because they tend to cut down on taxes, they tend to raise subsidies, and they tend to cut regulations. And so that obviously lowers the amount of government oversight, government cost on businesses, which can push the amount of sorry guys, I'm struggling this morning. It's Hugh. He's so cute back there, I just get distracted by him. Which can push the aggregate supply curve out and can lower our cost and can move the equilibrium, which is a great thing. Okay. And then we have our equilibrium point, which we just talked about. Let's go back and let's draw you some more pictures. So we have the things that move the aggregate supply curve. We got that. We're moving. We're chugging along here. I'm going to get you out of here and get you back to your weeks off. We're going to move on. We're going to talk about I want to talk about, we had a question last week. We were talking about our final projects, which again, if you were not there last week, I need you to go on and look up your final project online and make sure that you get your final project request into me by next week. So make sure that you do that. But we had a question last week about monetary and fiscal policy. So I want to talk to you about fiscal policy today. It's really important, it's really interesting, and it's one of these ways that we deal with, how do we deal with this movement of aggregate supply and aggregate demand when we're not operating in equilibrium? How do we deal with these things? Because when we have recessions, remember we go through business cycles. So how do we deal with recessions, or how do we deal when the economy is taken off and we have inflationary pressures and that's causing prices to get extreme and we have people really struggling and really hurting by these things? How do we deal with that? So I want to talk about fiscal policy, but before we get into fiscal policy, I want to talk about how some economists view this, because some economists think, well, the government shouldn't really do anything. Some of this stuff will just take care of itself. So let's talk about that first, because it gives us an idea a little bit of maybe how one way that aggregate supply shifts. Okay, so let's take an imaginary journey. Do you want to take an imaginary journey with me? Hugh wants to take an imaginary journey with me. Okay, let's take an imaginary journey with me. We live in a place, and in this place we have price, and we have GDP, and we have an aggregate demand curve, and we're going to imagine that it's straight. We have aggregate demand 1, and we have aggregate supply 1, aggregate supply 1, and we have, I need a different color, we have long run aggregate supply 1. And in this world, everything is happy. We're all happy. Everybody's friends. Everything's working well. We're all just chipper and kind, and everybody is feeling really, really good about themselves. Aren't you feeling good about yourself right now? And then something happens. Something bad happens, but it feels good. Maybe something happens like, oh, I hate to say it, because it feels really good. Maybe something happens like a tax cut. Sound familiar? I hope this isn't what happens in our world, but it could be. Maybe something happens like a tax cut. When things are going pretty good and we're all kind of in that right spot, and then for whatever reason, maybe a tax cut happens. And a tax cut happens, and our aggregate demand curve moves out because consumer spending goes up. And what happens? All of a sudden, we're way out here now. But our long-run aggregate supply curve, it doesn't like that. And what happens now? We have all this inflationary pressures, right? Now, we went from price level 1, P1, now we're all the way out here to right here. Remember, we are at full employment. Now we're all the way out here to Y2. What did we say was happening in the economy now? All these retired people started coming back into the workplace. Maybe people aren't going into college now because they can get jobs. Maybe people are leaving school early. Maybe people aren't retiring, right? And now all of a sudden we have inflation. We're at P2, right? That's what's happening right now. We see these things. We know they're happening. But what's going to happen after a while? People start to see that prices are going up. This is what some economists say will happen. People start to see, hold on, prices are going up. I need to get paid. You got to pay me more because I'm paying more for all my stuff. You got to pay up. And what's going to happen to employers after a while when everybody's coming to them and saying, you got to pay me more? Well, all of a sudden, labor prices go up. And what did we just say? If labor prices go up, what's going to happen? This aggregate supply curve is going to go up until we go and we make long-run aggregate supply happy. And what's going to happen? We're going to end up with high inflation, but long-run aggregate supply will always win, and we'll end up back at full employment. I would ask if that makes sense, but you can't answer me. And Hugh shook his head as I went through, so if he understood it, I'm assuming you understood it. Okay, so this is one economic theory of what would happen if we did nothing. This is one argument for the government not to get involved. But you see the challenge here. If the government doesn't get involved, what happens? We have high inflation. And people don't think we should have high inflation because who loses? All of us lose. We don't like inflation. We like some inflation. We like healthy inflation. This isn't really healthy inflation. It's kind of healthy inflation because it's cost push inflation, or it's demand pull inflation, but it's not the best inflation. Okay, so let's talk about fiscal policy. We've talked about fiscal policy. We've talked about the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is laws enacted by the government. So monetary policy is stuff done by the Federal Reserve. Remember, monetary policy is controlling the money supply. Fiscal policy is stuff done by Congress, so they can control taxes and they can control government spending. So those are really the only two avenues that the federal government has that they can control what happens. This is really awkward holding 3 markers in my hand, but I have this little ledge, so I can't deal with that. So I'm just going to hold them in my hand. Squirrel? Yes. So all they can do is they can increase or decrease spending, and they can control taxes, okay? So they can't do anything else. So that's all we're going to talk about today is fiscal policy and how does it work. I want to bring up a couple things that we've talked about recently. We need to know the multiplier effect, okay? So that's going to factor into this because remember the multiplier effect means that when we spend money or when we cut taxes, it has a multiple effect on the economy to get things to get working. And remember that when we enact fiscal policy, it's going to impact the demand side. It's not going to impact the supply side. It's going to impact demand side. It's going to shift demand because it's either going to impact government spending or it's going to impact consumer spending. It might also have an impact on investments, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's get going. So let's say we're operating in a recessionary environment. Well, let's talk about a recessionary environment. So we have price GDP. In a recessionary environment, what's it going to look like? We have our long run aggregate supply. We have our short run aggregate supply, and then we would have our aggregate demand curve. So what would be happening? We would have our P1 and we would have our Y1. And here would be our Y, let's just call it F for full employment. So we would be operating in a recession. We would be operating below optimal, right? We would be below natural employment, natural output. We would be operating in a recession. And what would we want to do? We would be wanting to shift up aggregate demand up to there, right? That's what we would want to do, okay? So how can we do that? Well, the federal government can do it one of two ways. They can do it through government spending, or they can do it through raising taxes. That's the only two ways that they can do it. Okay, so let's say that there is a balance missing, or let's say that we don't even care about this distance right now. Let's say the government says that they're going to spend $100 billion. That's what they can do. They can either give $100 billion in government spending, or they can give $100 billion in tax cuts. Let's look through and see what difference that's going to make, okay? Let's say the government is going to give $100 billion in government spending. So government spending $100 billion. You probably don't even understand that because you're so young, you probably never watched the movies, but you should watch the movies. And let's say we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8%. We put that in to find our multiplier. Our multiplier would then be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which would equal 1 over 1 minus 0.8%, which would equal 1 over 0.2, which would equal 5. So we would figure this out then as 100 billion times the multiplier, which equals 100 billion times 5, which equals 500 billion. So, and if you don't understand this, you either need to look at your stuff from last week, or you need to get notes from somebody from last week to understand this. So, if the government said, we'll spend 100 billion, their 100 billion with a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8% could have a $500 billion impact on the economy. Now let's say, and we did not talk about this last week, let's say the government said we'll give $100 billion in tax cuts. Now tax cuts have a different impact on the economy, and I'll tell you why. Let's say they're going to decrease taxes. Let's do this in a different color. So they're going to decrease taxes by 100 billion. Well, the tax multiplier is different than the regular multiplier. The tax multiplier actually looks like this. It is the multiple propensity to consume over 1 minus the multiple propensity to consume. So it's not 1 over 1 minus the multiple propensity to consume. It's the multiple propensity to consume over 1 minus the multiple propensity to consume. So in this case, it would be 0.8 over 1 minus 0.8, or 0.8 over 0.2, or that would equal 4. So we would have 100 billion times 4, which would equal 400 billion. So if the government just goes and spends the 100 billion, it would give a $500 billion boost, versus the government gives tax credits, it would be a $400 billion boost. Now what's the difference and why does it matter? Well, when the government spends that 100 billion, That 100 billion, that first 100 billion, it gets spent. So that's $100 billion into the economy. When the government gives tax credits for that first 100 billion, it doesn't get spent. So part of that first 100 billion gets saved. So that's the difference and why the taxes are not the same. Okay. Let's go and do this in reverse. I feel like I'm taking way more time than I had planned to take. Hugh, do you feel like I'm taking way more time than I had planned to take? See, this is what I do, Hugh. It all takes more time. Okay. Let's do this in reverse. Let's say that I know the size of my donut hole. Let's say that I have the same problem. Short run aggregate supply. Well, you know what? I'm not even going to draw it. It's going to be easier. Let's say that I know that I have a $100 billion hole. So I have a $100 billion hole, and I know I have a $100 billion hole. So if I have a $100 billion hole, and I have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75%, how much do I need to raise spending to get there? Well, it's the exact same thing. My multiplier then is going to be 1 over 1 minus 0.75, so my multiplier is going to be 4. So all I have to do is take 100 billion divided by 4, and I can spend 25 billion. We all get how we got there? Okay. If I'm going to do it in the other way, if I'm going to do it for taxes, I can do it and I can say, okay, marginal propensity to consume 0.75 over 1 minus 0.75. So I have 0.75 over 0.25. So I have 3, which is essentially negative 3. So I have to cut it by 100 billion divided by negative 3 because I have to decrease taxes, which would be roughly negative 33 billion. So I would have to cut taxes 33 billion, or I'd have to spend 25 billion. And the important thing here is that these can't be offset. So I can't spend 25 billion but raise taxes 25 billion. I can't cut taxes 33 billion but also lower spending 33 billion, or none of this will work. Make sense? Okay, and finally, let's go through one other thing really quick, because none of you want to be sitting in front of your computer any longer, and I've got other work to do. Let's talk about automatic stabilizers. Let's go back to the business cycle real quick. My markers are dying. Okay. We talked about in the business cycle. Over the course of time in the business cycle, in general, GDP is going to rise, right? Just in general, GDP is going to rise. But it's not going to go in a nice straight line. It's going to go like this, right? It's going to go like that. And so in general, it's going to go like that. But there are some automatic stabilizers in the economy, which means that we don't always have to enact new fiscal policy to help us get to where we need to go. We don't always have to raise taxes to slow down inflation. We don't always have to cut taxes to help boost the economy. There are some things that do that automatically. One thing is a progressive tax system that helps us do that. So one thing that does that is that as taxes rise, as things go up right here, we have a progressive tax system, which means that the more money that you make, the more taxes you pay. And what's interesting is actually it goes up proportionately faster, so that for every $10,000 you make, you pay proportionately more taxes. You jump into higher tax brackets. And so the more money you make, the higher taxes you go. So it automatically happens. Nobody has to change laws to make that happen. So what happens, there are three things, there are a few things, but there are a couple easy ones that are automatic stabilizers. One is taxes, and we have a progressive tax system, and that tax system works in reverse too. Is that as your income declines, you get to step down taxes and you pay progressively less. Another thing is welfare. So that automatically, as people make more money, people drop off of welfare, and so the government stops spending as much. As it declines, they start spending more. Another thing is unemployment. So there's these automatic things that nobody has to pass laws that make the government spend less or spend more as they move along. Sound good? Okay. Let's do a few more little slides, and then I'm going to go over the test real quick, and then we're going to be done. Let's see if the camera shuts off again, because it doesn't like this. Is it going to shut off? Hey! Technology! How about it? Okay. Built-in stabilizers. I just want to talk here about tax progressivity. There's three different types of tax systems, and I'm only really going over this because it's on your test. So the progressive tax system, as the progressive tax system goes, when it goes up, your taxes go up. When income goes up, your taxes go up. A proportional tax system, it just says that taxes stay the same regardless of what your income is. And a regressive tax system says that as income goes up, your taxes go down. Really all I care about is progressive tax system. Fiscal policy, we didn't talk about this. Is it expansionary, neutral, or contractionary? So expansionary is the government making policies that specifically during a recessionary times, but really can be any time, because we see expansionary policy with the tax cuts that are going on now. Are they doing such that will help the economy grow? Are we doing things that will expand, that will help that aggregate demand curve move towards the right? Neutral, are we doing things that really don't make any difference at all and just letting things stand as normal? Or contractionary, are they trying to pull the aggregate demand curve back in? The cyclically adjusted budget. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's complicated. We could spend a ton of time on it. I don't really care about it that much. What I do want you to know is just that the cyclically adjusted budget is a way of taking previous year's budgets and bringing them together to compare them against each other to see actually what is happening. So that's all you really need to know. It's kind of like real GDP, setting it against inflationary pressures and things like that. So it's just a way of bringing them together and comparing them against each other on a real number basis. That's all you really need to know about them. Here's a complicated way of looking at it that we don't care about. Okay. Here is the problems with fiscal policy, and there are many, many problems with fiscal policy. And the reason why fiscal policy has problems is because politics are involved. And when politics are involved, there's problems with everything. So let's talk about them real quick. One of the problems is the recognition leg. This is a problem with fiscal and monetary policy. When recessions start, nobody wants to recognize that it's a recession. We all just want to say, oh, maybe it's something small. So it's very difficult to understand that it's actually happening. And then there's an administration leg. We have to agree about what to do about it. And so sometimes that can take super long, and by the time they actually figure it out, we have monetary policy already happening in the background, and so it's very, very difficult to have it actually be meaningful. And then once they agree on it, we have operational leg, because then it actually has to be put into practice. So it can be very slow in responding on stuff that really needs to happen very, very quickly. Then we have political business cycles, and I fear that some of this might be happening with some of the current fiscal policy that we're seeing. And political business cycle is just making fiscal policy for political gain. It's not really about doing some of the things that are best for the economy. It's not really about doing something for the gain of the economy. It's more about doing something to score political points. How do I get reelected? How do I get donors? How do I get people to support me in my special interest? And that happens in both parties all the time. It's not a Republican or Democrat thing, but it is dangerous because we talked about that some of these fiscal policies, you can only implement them so often. And when you kind of shoot that arrow when you don't need to shoot that arrow, it's an arrow you don't have to spend when you really need it. So it can be dangerous. Future policy reversals, somebody else can come in and take it away. Offsetting state and local finance, this happens all the time. You cut taxes at the federal level, so the state says, well, I can raise taxes here. Or you raise spending, so the state says, I'm going to cut spending because they're having problems. And then the crowding out effect. This is a really interesting one. This is going to be on your test. Sometimes to pay for all of this, the government has to borrow money. Well, when the government borrows money, that means there's less money available, which can raise interest rates, which can mean that private spending actually goes down. And when private spending goes down, that can have an impact on the overall investment. Remember we said that there might, on the aggregate demand curve, investment is a part of it, and government spending can have an impact on investment. Well, this is where the crowding out effect comes, is that government can borrow so much that there's not enough money in the money supply for private investment to be able to borrow, or it can become so dude guys, I'm sorry. It can be so expensive that they can't afford it. So that's a crowding out effect, and that'll be on your test. And here's how current thinking on fiscal policy is. Most economists say the Federal Reserve should really handle short-run fluctuations, that this shouldn't even be something that the government does. Fiscal policy should be evaluated in terms of long-term effects. This should not be short-term. And this, in part, is part of the reason that Republicans did give tax cuts. Is their argument was this really isn't a short-term issue. This is a long-term philosophical issue that we should have lower taxes in this country, and that it should be used to enhance work effort, investment, and innovation, and that government spending should be on public capital projects, and that should encourage projects in other areas. That's it. Thank goodness. Let's go over your test super quick. Okay. Let's go over your test real quick. Business cycle, we've talked about this for months and months. I expect you to be pretty good at that. Consumer durables, we talked about that a few weeks ago. Durables are the items that you don't have to have, and those are the ones that get hit the hardest in a recession. Frictional unemployment, that's one of the good types of unemployment. Cyclical unemployment, that's one of the bad types of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment, that's the rate of unemployment set by economists and that a healthy economy has. The consumer price index, remember, on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve. That's the index that's on the left that is really based off of how we set that aggregate supply demand curve. Demand pull inflation, that's the good type of inflation. Core inflation, that's the root inflation that we deal with. Average propensity to consume, we've talked about that a lot. Marginal propensity to consume, aggregate demand. The interest rate effect, we talked about that a few weeks ago, and what it can do and how it can impact people, and why that impacts why the aggregate demand curve slopes down. Business taxes, degree of excess capacity, we talked about that last week in terms of the aggregate demand curve and investment. Immediate short-run aggregate supply curve, we talked about that. Short-run aggregate supply curve, we talked about that today. Productivity, we talked about it today. Real GDP as it relates to aggregate supply and demand, we talked about that the last 2 weeks. Expansionary fiscal policy, we talked about that today. Budget deficit, That's just in terms of the government will take on a budget deficit in order to give tax cuts, or in order to go into spending in order to boost the economy. Built-in stabilizers, we talked about that today. Progressive tax system, we talked about that today. Cyclically adjusted budget, I talked to you about that today. Political business cycle, I talked about that today. And crowding out effect, talked about that today. If you have any questions, all those terms are in your book. You can look them up. Be able to know and compute. You should be able to do these from the last few weeks. Unemployment rate, real interest rate, and investment determination based on it. This is going to look like I'm going to give you a real interest rate. I'm going to give you an expected rate of return. I'm going to give you a nominal interest rate. I'm going to say, should you do this project? You're going to say yes or no. Then I'm going to give you an inflation rate. And then you're going to say, should you do this project? Yes or no. Have questions on it? Ask it before the test. I'm going to give you a marginal rate of consumption, an MPC, marginal propensity to consume. And a multiplier, and then I'm going to give you a tax multiplier. I need you to know a shortcoming of the unemployment rate, who is hurt by inflation, and a non-income determination of consumption. And I am so kind and benevolent that I even gave you page numbers. You are welcome. If you have any questions, come to the test ready to ask those. If you have any concerns, please let me know. I'm out of town the week that we're supposed to have class. I'm in Disney World with my kids, the happiest place on earth. Don't make it the most unhappy place on earth for me and send me a bunch of things and expect me to answer right away, because I probably won't. I'll be back in town Saturday before class. Please reserve your questions for then. I'll be happy to answer them. Or we have a 3-hour class period, and all we have to do is take a test. So bring them. You know I will be kind and generous with answering your questions before the test. I want you all to succeed. I'll miss you while I'm gone. I hope you have a great week. Adios.